Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to the BioTherapy Live program. We welcome today to our virtual stage the illustrious Dr. David J.A. Goldsmith, whose titles and diplomas, if all lined up, would number more than the letters in his name. And that doesn't even include his certification as a whiskey expert.
True.
He describes himself in his bio sketch as, quote, a highly experienced and motivated former clinician, trained and working in London, now a seasoned pharmaceutical physician and biosciences entrepreneur, unquote. To be more specific, Dr. Goldsmith did his preclinical and clinical medical student training from 1977 to 1983 at St. John's College in Cambridge and was awarded his medical degree in 1980. Thereafter, he trained at Brompton, Hammersmith, St. Thomas's, National Hospital for Nervous Diseases, and did a senior registrar rotation at the Manchester Royal Infirmary. From 1995 to 1998, he was consultant nephrologist at Brighton University Hospital. And from there, he moved on to Guy's and St. Thomas's hospitals, where he remained a consultant nephrologist until October 2017. Even as a clinician, he was deeply involved in research. From 2010 to 2016, for example, he managed clinical research support for the London NIHR Comprehensive Research Network with budgets from 10 to 20 million pounds. Throughout this period, he has been a medical advisor to dozens of pharmaceutical companies. Most recently, though, he was a co-founder of SolasCure in 2017 and still functions as its chief medical officer. His work with SolasCure is what we will be focusing on today. But if I stop talking and give him the rest of the hour, maybe he will even have time to speak about his many side interests as well, such as music and photography, Scandinavia, and of course, whiskey. So I'll hand over the virtual microphone to you, Dr. Goldsmith.
Well, thank you very much, Ronald. Thank you, Albert, for the technical assistance, and welcome everybody. Should I share my screen now, or is this already being done? I'll share my screen, hopefully. Let's just see. There we are. So hopefully now you see a slide. Yeah, and that is the title slide. And I am, as Ronald has said, David Goldsmith. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I've been doing the last few years in a heroic, if not at times Herculean effort to try to bring a medical drug to wound care. And those of you involved in wound care will know that medical drugs are few and far between. There are very, very few, at least drugs that have been developed as a pharmaceutical. I'll come back to that point. But this is all in the service of the gift of the maggot, because all of this started well over a decade ago, possibly 15 years ago, when a German company near Frankfurt, itself an enzyme repository with tens of thousands of frozen proteins and enzymes, discovered that it had the ability to extract from live maggots, given a good feed, their main, but by no means their only, proteolytic enzyme, a serine threonase. And I'll deal with that quickly as we go through in a minute. The question is what to do with something like that. And there are a lot of discussions with a lot of different people. But in the end, we felt, that is SolasCure in embryo, as it were, felt that this could be a good idea for wound debridement or debridement, depending on your penchant for pronunciation. And that's essentially what we did. We have the license for that use of that enzyme. And I'll take you through some of the twists and turns that we found along our somewhat tortuous route to where we are today. But it comes from and involves the maggot. And I think if it succeeds commercially, will be a significant advance for wound care. But there's still some way to go. So just see if I can get to the next slide. Here we are, a quick look at a maggot. I'm actually going to take you through our trial, a clinical trial, because I like to talk about clinical trials and clinical things, not just the science behind it. And for our target, first in human, we chose venous leg ulcers. They're tough in some ways. They're often in people with a lot of comorbidities. They're often painful. And one of the things we wanted to see was whether the application of this enzyme, and I'll explain a little bit more about how it was purified in a moment, was actually going to be tolerable as well as efficacious. And that's essentially what we set out to try and do. So as you know very well, and these are slides from Hadar Levtov, whom I think many of you will have heard of, working with the team in Miami. What we want to be able to do with wounds is to clean them and get them into a position where something, whether that's Mother Nature or another product applied to the wound bed, will accelerate their healing. With chronic venous leg ulcers, it's less often a graft or a skin substitute, although in the US that is more common. In most of the rest of the world, it is just left a natural second intent healing. But the key to it is to prepare the wound bed in some way or other, and we know there are many ways to achieve debridement. But if you can get from A to B on those slides, and you can do it reasonably quickly, then there is at least the potential prospect for healing. Of course, a clean wound does not automatically heal, and we all know that. So biological debridement, and you guys will know this very well. I've got Joe Dunbill's iconic slide here from her BMJ publication in 2009. And you can see that there is much better debridement compared to hydrogel and compression. But what we are looking for is an insect-specific serine protease. And we know that there are lots of different secretions. And what we want to see is the slough disappearing and granulation tissue forming. We know that biological debridement has synergism with antibiotics. It certainly has an antibacterial effect. And we know it's much faster than hydrogel. Hydrogel is far too slow, really, to be satisfactory. And the question really is whether or not these wounds will heal faster. And as we know from the Dumbill study, sadly, that wasn't the case. The debridement was a striking success and happened quickly with larval therapy, but the healing did not. And we may come back to touch on that later in terms of an interpretation as to why that failed. In fact, the trial wasn't set up to achieve that, and we can come back to that. And there was a small, I think the signal was rather small myself, but reading the paper, there was a small increase in ulcer pain and discomfort. I think it's an aesthetic feeling of potentially having the maggots on the wound, but that's for discussion and debate. But that's really the background to this. We knew that if we could use a biological therapy of this sort, there is at least the prospect of it working. And this, of course, has been honed over millions of years of evolution. And actually, although there is this discussion or description of an increased ulcer pain or discomfort, the reality, I think, is that nature has made it so that the maggots can get on with their job with a minimum disturbance to the host. That, after all, is a successful parasite, not one that causes a huge wheal or welt and causes a lot of pain, because then it's brought to people's attention and it may then be ejected from the body, the surface of the body. We know, above all else, that biological debridement is super fast. I mean, even when I discuss some of the other enzymes that are available now today for wound debridement, biological debridement is faster still and can be achieved very straightforwardly in many cases, provided you have a suitable wound and a patient that will accept the therapy. But as you know, I mean, for biological reasons, the time of administration and application of the maggot is modest, a matter of a few days before other factors supervene, as I'll show you in a moment. So it has to be fast, but you can achieve dramatic results. And here, another slide from Associate Professor Hadar Levtov, you can even get things, small wounds, to be cleaned in less than a day. And that's staggeringly successful, and then would move that wound on theoretically. So what's the problem with maggots? Well, we all know what the problem with maggots is. And that is if the delivery is delayed or there is a problem of some sort in terms of distribution, then we have an unfortunate set of circumstances. So where we started from was the idea, but this is not proven, and this is one of the problems with this field, is that wound debridement seems beneficial. Wound bed preparation, in terms of the tissue and the edge and the moisture and the other elements of time, that's been around for 20 years and is a well-accepted paradigm even in 2024. Old-fashioned enzymatic debridement, and I'll come back to that because that has a particular US domain in terms of the enzyme that's available to most of the US clinicians, is slow, whereas biological debridement, if done in expert hands, is very successful, but many people give up. You either can't get the maggots, it's too difficult, it's too expensive, and the patient won't accept it. Now, that's a commonly held view, and there may be people on this broadcast who would disagree very strongly with that. But nevertheless, that's what we understood to be the case. And talking to many clinicians, there is at least an element of truth to that. So what we wanted to do was to try and solve this, if you like, delivery gap with a safe, effective. I use the word low skill not in a pejorative sense. I'm using it in the sense of this could be used by trained nursing staff. This could be used even in the patient's home eventually, and not need a hospital visit. And that, I think, is important for large numbers of elderly, frail patients. If the pandemic has taught us anything, and it's very questionable whether it taught some countries anything, if you'll forgive me saying that, if it taught us anything, it is the fact that where possible, we should do research and do treatment as close to the patient's home as possible for a whole stack of reasons, including getting a more representative sample of patients than those fit enough to get themselves to a research center. So this is what we set out to try and do, a noble aim. Now, enzymatic debridement itself, because we are at the end of the day using an enzyme, but one from nature, has problems. Those of us who are old enough can remember old school enzymes, ureases and other factors like that, that caused hypersensitivity reactions, local difficulties with damage to viable healthy tissue. They could be painful. There were examples of absorption of the enzyme into the bloodstream, which is always a technical risk and causing downstream problems to the rest of the patient. While an anesthetic diabetic foot ulcer with neuropathy, the pain issue is not an issue. If you look at chronic venous leg ulcers and traumatic wounds, you'll find that these patients are rather hyperesthetic and they are very sensitive to disturbance of the wound. And if you put an abrasive and chemically active enzyme into that wound, they won't thank you for doing that. A lot of the enzymes that have been used and still are used come from the world of burns. And burns, of course, you have an eschar, a hard, thick, black eschar, which usually in acute burns is taken off with surgery. But we know there are plenty of older patients or patients who have widespread burns for whom the surgery will be basically impractical. And enzymes were devised, a pineapple stem enzyme, which is now well known for MediWound, to try to burn off the eschar and then allow a skin graft to be placed. In the context of burns, minutes and hours count. They're really important for the patient in terms of getting a definitive intervention for the burn. In terms of chronic wounds, that simply isn't the case. Hours and minutes don't count in the same way. An ulcer could take 3 to 4 months to heal if it's of substantial size. You don't have to necessarily use aggressive measures to clean the wound within a few minutes, unless there is some other factor. And what we felt was that the use of aggressive enzymes to burn off whatever's lying on top of the wound bed was unhelpful, potentially prejudicial, could also lead to damage to the local tissues. The US has an enzyme. It's been around, I think it was let through in the early to mid 60s, around the time of, tragically, JFK's assassination, that era. So that's how long ago Santyl was permitted, grandfathered in by the FDA. The trials it had were, how can I put it, modest in their scope and scientific value. And when you speak to clinicians today in the US, it's notoriously slow. It takes 2, 3, 4 weeks of daily application. I have to say it does do something. The reason for it being so slow, in my opinion, is that the enzyme itself, it's a collagenase, and there are several different sorts of biological collagenase, but the Smith and Nephew one, the original one here, does definitely attack wound tissue, but unfortunately, it's put into a sort of Vaseline gel. And that Vaseline gel is brilliant for holding the gel onto the wound bed, but very poor at releasing the enzyme to be active in the wound bed itself. And this is, if you like, the Achilles heel of this particular therapy. It's not that the enzyme is a bad enzyme, it's the enzyme is largely inaccessible to the wound, and it takes repeated application. And if you use this, as many podiatrists do, for example, as a once-a-week intervention, once a week, that's not as the label says daily. But if you use it once a week and leave it on for a week, it's very dubious that you'll actually see much within a few weeks. It's helpful in a sense, but so are lots of other things. But it doesn't give enzymes a great name in the US. Having said that, look at the revenue stream, because there is a remunerative code. So in the old school way of saying these things, follow the money. And there's plenty of money in enzymatic debridement, even with an enzyme that at best is mediocre. I think it's fair, I can call it that. I'm sure litigation may follow, but there we are. So we wanted to try to take a different approach to this. We had an enzyme that the company in Germany called Brain AG, just outside Frankfurt in a little village called Zwingenberg, they had managed to isolate a trypsin-type serine protease cloned from maggots of the green bottlefly. And they had mixed it with a hydrogel, and the aim was to improve wound bed preparation. And there's a lot of preclinical data. I'm not going to bore you with all the preclinical data because I want to show you clinical data. But there's a lot of preclinical data, and amongst that, using models of acute wounds that are then super infected with a biofilm containing MRSA, there is evidence that we have an antibacterial effect. I don't think we actually destroy the bacteria as such, but I think what we do is reduce the bacterial load by solubilizing biofilm and the sort of muck on the base of the ulcer, allowing that then to be removed more easily. But this is quite an impressive effect. And we did this through, again, the University of Miami. And it's very clear with Steve Davis, who's well known for putting these sort of models of MRSA together and super infection. And it was an impressive outcome, as good as pretty much anything he'd seen. And he's seen a lot of preparations. So what we wanted to do is to do what I've shown you, take the enzyme out of the maggot, purify it to the point where it could be exhibited to a human being, and then mix that with a hydrogel and apply it as a sort of gel to the wound under compression. Because let's not forget that if we're dealing with chronic venous leg ulcers, the appropriate treatment paradigm there is to gain control of the fluid in and around the wound. And you do that initially with compression, 2 or 4 layer compression. Eventually, the edema and swelling reduce, and then that's the point at which you need to use compression a bit less. But essentially, you start with a very waterlogged, boggy sort of wound into which you then apply this substance. And then we press that in and leave it for 48 hours or 72 hours, 3 times a week, change it over. Our preparation could be used twice a week very easily. we're looking at whether we could use it once a week, but we don't have data on that at the moment. That's something that will come. Just very quickly, on one slide on animal data, this is the Steve Davis model. It's a deep second-degree thermal burn. You have there on the left-hand panel a sort of pale yellow square or oblong, and that is a biofilm stuffed full of MRSA, very high bacterial counts. On the right-hand side, before and after, you have, after about 3 or 4 applications of our enzyme, this is done daily on the back of pigs. So this is not on a human being at this stage. You can't wound a human being and infect their wounds. That's, I think, would largely be thought of as being unethical. So we did this in animals, but it was strikingly successful, and we were able to clear up the slough. And there was both a time and a concentration dependent effect of debridement. That's quite important in terms of establishing a potential proof of concept. We'll see more of time and concentration a little later when we deal with the human data. So our idea is that we have a wound gel that will help the wound bed. The first stage of that is to affect the debridement, but we're also aiming to reduce the problems with fluid in the wound and to encourage healing. I should point out, and again, I haven't got the data to show you here because we could spend a day speaking about the last 70 years easily. We do have very good specificity for fibrin, but I must point out that there is some activity of this enzyme against elastin and collagen. It's not as much as fibrin. It's about 10 times bigger for fibrin than elastin and collagen. But there is evidence, we've got, again, in vitro, that we are able to do more than just the one single target fibrin. And that's quite handy because, to my surprise and consternation, frankly, it's not entirely clear what's in slough a lot of the time. We simply look at it, it looks yellow and mucky. Sometimes it smells a bit, and then we try and get rid of it. We can slice it off, we can dice it off, we can scrape it off, we can burn it off, we can remove it by surgery. But if you're going to try and tackle it in a slightly different way, it would be quite useful to understand what the substrate was. And I suspect it does vary rather more than we give it credit for. But to this end, it's some comfort to us that we have mainly fibrinolytic, but also elastolytic and collagenylytic impacts as well on whatever's lying down there. As I said, I don't think we destroy biofilm like some agents claim to do. I use the word claim, but we do reduce the bacterial load within superinfected wounds. Now, we thought this was a medical device. Why not? We had a gel. It was an external therapy. We did have a bioprotein that was pharmaceutically made in the way that you would make any biopharmaceutical, any sort of therapeutic. We went to the United Kingdom regulator in 2020, and they said, no, it's a drug. It's a drug because you have an enzymatic mode of action, and you're going to be treated as a drug, and you'll have to do a pharmaceutical program of development. That was very much, we got an IND open with the FDA, and they took exactly the same view. Now, that was a bit of a moment for us because we hadn't planned for that, and we hadn't raised money for that because the pharmaceutical bit, is very much more expensive than a device. Nevertheless, we took a little while, raised some more money, and then started down the path of trying to get a pharmaceutical program put together as though we were Eli Lilly or Merck's Sharp Dome or one of the big boys with hundreds of billions of dollars. So what we did was to take up an opportunity that the regulator did give us, and that is to go straight to human beings. You can't wound a healthy volunteer, in my opinion, and then see what happens. Actually, that's up for debate because I've seen another program where that was permitted, but we were not permitted to do that. And in many ways, I'm glad. So what we were allowed to do is to take people with existing chronic venous leg ulcers and see whether or not we can prove safety and, to some degree, that we were allowed efficacy in terms of the action on the ulcers. And this is sloughy ulcers. So we set out with the primary objective to look at the safety and local tolerability of an ascending dose design, which is so typical for phase 1 or early phase 2 pharmaceutical studies, where you're looking to try to form or establish a level of toxicity below which you then stick for the remainder of your program. And obviously, we were administering this topically. Our secondary objectives were to look for systemic absorption, going back to my comment about the risk of that. And given that we have a fibrinolytic enzyme, you'll have already wondered about what would happen if a fibrinolytic got into the bloodstream. Would there be local bleeding? Would there be systemic bleeding? Would there be something that's very unpleasant and uncalled for, or could there be hypersensitivity? So we had to see whether or not there was any evidence of absorption, to do which we had to develop our own assays with external help, of course, to characterize what was going on in terms of where this enzyme was going. And to cut a long story short, what we found was that alpha-1 globulins in the bloodstream, natural fibrinolytics, were actually chewing up our enzyme. We were actually able to prove that in terms of them forming a complex and then disappearing. So any absorption of our enzyme is for just a minute or two, no longer, and is then completely degraded. So we don't have the prospect, in fact, of having an effect on clotting. And I'll show you data on that a little later. And equally, because it doesn't get into the bloodstream appreciably, the likelihood of anti-drug antibodies and an immunogenetic effect is very small. We had to look at blood clotting factors, even though we proved later there was no absorption. And we wanted to assess wound debridement at multiple ascending doses. And also, of course, the critical point and the critical importance to regulators and patients is what effect was all of this having on the potential for the wound to heal? Because there's no point cleaning a wound to perfection to find it then is stuck around for weeks and months on end because somehow you've disrupted the normal healing processes. So that had to be shown, at least to the extent it could be, in a short-term trial of this nature. Now, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, but on this occasion, this is a very complicated picture. And in explaining the picture, I'll be using 1,000 words, but that's one of the ironies of slides. So what we have is 5 cohorts labeled C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, different colored squares along the top there, starting with hydrogel, and then a second cohort of patients. So this is not the same set of patients having 5 things applied. This is 5 separate patient cohorts started in sequence on hydrogel, a small amount of enzyme, a bigger amount of enzyme, and even bigger, and the top concentration. If you look at C2, it says wound gel, 1 unit per mil. And that concentration of our taramase enzyme is what the bioengineers at the Brain AG German company just outside Frankfurt, they found that that was the concentration you got if you fed maggots very generously and let them make their enzyme. That's the same concentration in their secretions. So let's bear that in mind, because that's in theory, and Ronald will remind me later if I don't mention it, that the enzyme is only one small part of what a maggot does. But that at least is the same level of enzyme, and it's the same enzyme because we've been able to bioengineer it to be exactly the same. So there's no difference in terms of what the tertiary structure is, and likely, I think, of the function either. And then what we had to do was see these patients 3 times a week for a total of 4 weeks, a total, in fact, of 14 visits. So although I was telling you earlier how important it is to get the patients in their own home, the irony of that is that with these sorts of trials, because of an abundance of caution, to use the FDA phrase, that it's very necessary to take extreme care of these patients and make sure there is no problem. There was a big issue with this because we had to see what the local effect of this enzyme was on a wound. Now, just think for a minute, if as part of our therapeutic intervention, we'd use one of those sort of washing cloths, Debrisoft, and scrubbed away at the wound. Now, clinically, that's exactly what we would have loved to have done. But ask yourself a question. How can I tell what the impact of our single product is on debridement if I'm using a second measurement of a second method of debridement. Second, Debrisoft can be uncomfortable or painful depending on who's applying it and how they're doing it. How can I approach the idea of whether my enzyme is painful or painless if I'm causing pain to the same wound? So from first principles, we were not allowed, and it was not sensible to try, to manipulate the wound in any major degree. And I think this is one of the reasons when I show you the results, they are promising but not definitive. As well as the enzyme in the gel, we had compression 3 times a week. So we were giving these patients state-of-the-art, a little old-fashioned, yes, I know, but state-of-the-art chronic venous leg ulcer therapy. And some of them got enzyme and some of them didn't, is basically what it boiled down to. And then we looked very carefully. So where did we get our patients from? Oh, I should just point out, by the way, that just as we got the permission to do this, there was a major event involving a virus causing a pandemic. So I have to say that did put us on the back foot. It took, over a year before we were able to find sites that could actually do this work in the middle of COVID. And thank goodness for private enterprise and capitalism, because it was very possible to do this in the US. Many countries in Europe basically stopped doing non-life-threatening research. As an example, the United Kingdom, we stopped all non-life-threatening research for about 21 months because there isn't the staff to do both. So all the effort was on COVID-related problems and perhaps trials like cancer chemotherapy that had to continue. But treatments like ours were not considered to be important enough, and therefore most of the centers that we had envisaged using closed to new customers. In the end, we found centers in the US. I won't name them all, but they were dotted around the US. And we found centers in Hungary. These were private centers, and they were ready and able to find patients and treat them. And in the end, we got a total of 43 patients. I would love this to have been done in one center, or maybe 1.5, if you get my meaning, because you get consistency in this sort of study if you have absolute uniformity of how the patients are recruited and how they're treated. And while we specified all of that, the reality is I've got 3 countries involved and I've got several different sites involved. And while you can write all the code and all the instructions you like and send them through the magic of email, it doesn't automatically mean that they're followed to the letter. So this is a drawback. But on the plus side, more than half the patients came from one single center who got extremely good indeed at using our product. So overall, we managed to do this. It took us 1.5 years longer than it should have done, most of which I'm afraid was down to COVID and the consequences. But nevertheless, we were able to do this. So how did we choose the patients? We were under constraints again from the regulator. These could not be patients with too many comorbidities. There had to be an element of safety here. They couldn't have any serious degree of kidney impairment. They couldn't have liver abnormality. They couldn't be on a blood thinning agent. They couldn't do this and they couldn't do that. There were about 9 indications for use, or in terms of inclusion criteria. And at our worst, we had 27 exclusion criteria. Now, anybody who's done a trial will know what that means. So it was quite hard to recruit these patients, but little by little, we did manage to do that. We found that they were older patients. You'll see in the top red oblong there, horizontal oblong, you'll see the age and the mean. They seemed to get younger as the cohorts went by. That's because we started to use the US more, and the US had access to a slightly different group of patients. There were slightly more women than men. They were a little overweight, possibly not for the US, but for most of the rest of the world. Their baseline wound size was around 10 to 20 square centimeters. So they had enough wound there not to heal up too quickly, so we could actually keep on applying our agent. And in terms of the non-viable tissue, apart from the first cohort, they had buckets load of slough. And this was a key inclusion criterion, that they had plenty of slough. After all, why would you try to use a debriding agent when no physician would say that this wound needs debriding? So these were wounds that would otherwise have had to have had another form of debridement used. In terms of what we found, the pharmacokinetics, as I said to you a little earlier, there was no evidence of any absorption of our enzyme, and we have separate mechanistic data, as I explained to you, that shows that this is degraded by the main serum protease and is basically not there in any appreciable concentrations. The concentrations were very small. They were there for about a minute at most, and then they disappeared completely. So I think that's quite reassuring. And this has been accepted as a package in terms of the toxicity by both the FDA and the UK, and indeed the European regulator. So I think we can take some comfort from that, though one can never be completely complacent about toxicity with any biotherapeutic agent. There were no anti-drug antibodies detected. Not too surprising, let's be honest. It's only a month. Typically, anti-drug antibodies take anything from 6 months to 2 or 3 years, if not longer. But we were not able to find some. And again, we had to make our own assay to detect them. But we had positive and negative controls in there, and it was a valid assay. Importantly, there was no evidence of any disturbance of the blood clotting mechanism, prothrombin, APTT, fibrinogen concentrations, various other factors that we looked at. And I said to you that nobody with a bleeding diathesis and nobody on any form of anticoagulant was eligible for this study out of an abundance of caution. But as I'll show you in a minute, we also had no bleeding from the wounds as well, which is also very reassuring, because the local concentration of the enzyme in the wound, of course, is very much higher than anything we could even detect transiently in the bloodstream. So the safety analysis included hematology at visit 1, 5, and 14, all the clinical chemistry you could ever want to see and more. Urinalysis, because we're doing a safety study. We don't expect anything in the urinalysis, but we did it all the same. Physical exam, and trying to anticipate the onerous demands of the FDA, we did an ECG at the beginning and the end, and there was no difference in that as well. So all of these parameters, all of them, there was no evidence of any change as a result of exposure to the enzyme over the 4 weeks and 12 applications that we were able to carefully characterize. So that much is good. But in a way, we'd be very, very unlucky and have a serious problem if we'd had any problem with that list of things at this very early stage of development. Now, in a pharmaceutical study, there is great emphasis on adverse events, serious adverse events, unattributable and attributable adverse events, unexpected severe adverse events, etc. Quite different from a device trial, where these things are not looked at in the same obsessional and careful way. So we did find a number of adverse events that were reported of mild to moderate severity. When you have an adverse event in a pharma study, and this was true of the COVID vaccines as well, you have to ask the doctors involved, do you think it was anything to do with the therapy, or do you have any other explanation? And those doctors will say, oh, very unlikely, possibly, quite likely, oh, you bet, it was definitely down to the therapy. And they have to judge the likelihood. So out of the 41, 33 were considered unrelated to the study treatment. And this was judged by the clinicians, not by the company. 8 adverse events were possibly related to study treatment. And what did we find? We found maceration of the wound infection, including cellulitis, peri-wound erythema, and peri-wound irritation. Now, the problem we have here is this is not a controlled study. But if you look in the literature, it's not a controlled study because it can't be at this stage because we're doing a safety study. The control study comes next. But if you look in the literature, maceration, wound infection, cellulitis, erythema, irritation, that's the natural history of many people's chronic venous leg ulcers. So I don't think there's any evidence one way or the other, let's put it that way, that we have a problem with this therapy based on the level of data that we have with the trial design that we used. The proof of the pudding will come with a randomized control study when we will look at the incidence of all of these things. We had no evidence of drug-related toxicity or a dose-limiting toxicity. We had 2 serious adverse events. I think this comes mainly from the fact that our patients were between, I think the youngest patient was about 45, the oldest was well into their 80s. So we had one with erysipelas and DVT and a septicemia, and we had one due basically who seemed to have an anemia, and that was later shown to be due to a bleeding gastric ulcer, but not, I think, anything to do with our particular therapy, as far as anybody can tell. And these serious adverse events were deemed by the investigators unrelated to our treatment. Now, you may say, gosh, what a lot of side effects there. But I would suggest to you it's about one per patient. And when you have patients in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and you keep asking them questions about what's going on, I can promise you, and I've done a lot of studies in kidney patients as old, if not older, you will get shed loads of adverse events, typically between 75 and 125%, as it were, per patient. So this, to me, is not too surprising. And the only way to avoid it will be to use patients who are super fit and they don't get chronic venous leg ulcers. So that's not going to happen. So what we looked at in terms of our results, I've shown you the safety data. We feel reassured overall by these safety data. And now I'm going to try and show you a little bit about whether this acted as a debridement agent. Now, what I'd like to see, if this is going to be super convincing, is evidence of quicker debridement and more complete debridement the more enzyme we use. So we've got a 4-week period. Each of those bars represents a week. Each of those bars represents a different enzyme concentration. Apologies. Across the x-axis, you can see changes a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks. As those bars become more and more negative, that's the amount of slough that's disappearing from the wounds. So our interpretation is that if you look particularly at, there are four, as it were, there are four sections, and each of those sections has 4 bars in it. And if you look at those bars, particularly the dark blue, you see the highest enzyme concentration. And what you find is that with the high enzyme concentration, you do get debridement, and it's a little quicker with the high enzyme. But you don't get complete debridement. I'll explain to you why you don't get that in a second. We felt that from this, and this is only one part of the evidence, we were getting some level of debridement happening. I need to do this against a control, because you're going to say to me, but you also use hydrogel and you also use compression. So how do you know it's your enzyme? I only know it's the enzyme. Actually, I only believe it's the enzyme because there is more where you use more enzyme. There is more debridement when you use the 9 times enzyme compared to the lower concentrations. And this happens particularly after about 4 weeks. Similarly, I can switch the whole thing around, as we typically do, and look at granulation, which is, if you like, the mirror image of slough. Here it's a little clearer, and you have lowest concentration of enzyme, and then 2, 5, and 9 times. And I would think that there is some evidence there that over the repetition of therapy, there is more debridement taking place. So each set of weeks there. And in addition to that, you can see, particularly with the dark blue, that there is more granulation tissue with the higher concentration of enzyme. So I think that shows it a little clearer than the presence of slough there. And we did this with digital cameras, of course, and these were independently reported images. So just to be clear on that point, it wasn't purely just done by the investigators themselves and all the differences you'd see between the units, but all the pictures were gathered up and independently reported. So it's our perception that we have some evidence, particularly as you start to use more enzyme, of faster and more complete debridement. But do we have complete debridement? No, we do not. Out of the 43 wounds, 5 of them debrided completely. That's not shown on the slide, but that's a matter of fact. And all of those were in the highest or second highest enzyme group. So that's 5 units per mil and 9 units per mil. So taken together, we believe we have evidence of safety at all enzyme concentrations, and we have some evidence of efficacy only particularly at the slightly higher enzyme concentrations. And when we do take those data together, we believe that this provides some proof of concept that we have an agent that's safe and has at least some efficacy for debridement. And it then begs the question about what to do next. Before I come to what we do next, I want to make a focus on pain, because I made a big point about pain earlier in terms of previous enzymes. We spent a lot of time looking at pain in these patients. So what we did was we had for all of the patients extended times of symptom recording. And in some patients, we had an 8-hour window of patient pain recording where they had to sit and have repeated questions and do the usual visual analog scale of pain. The gold bars here, so this is basically a numerical reporting scale, 0 to 10. The gold bars, there are 6 pairs of bars there, as you can see. The gold color is baseline, and the blue color is after the application of our drug. And you can see the different concentrations, 1 to 9, and all patients aggregated in the 6th set of bars. We could find no evidence of pain increase in any of our 43 patients where we'd applied the enzyme in the gel. I am not going to make, I'm not the sort of person who will try to be a marketeer and make a positive message out of it. You could say, what if you did all the scores and did a paired t-test and looked at the pre to post? We did not set out with any statistical plan to do this. So I refuse to do it, actually. My hunch, but it's a hunch, it's not a proof. My hunch is that you probably would find a statistically significant reduction in pain. And if you were to find that, one explanation might be that we have a soothing agent. I don't think we have an anesthetic agent, but we have a soothing agent that we apply into the wound bed. This is encouraging if it's in the context of providing debridement, because it might indicate that we could use this therapy in a quite a widespread way. Again, I emphasize the importance of doing a randomized control study, which is what we have planned and are raising money to do, because then we'll have a real way of teasing out what the impact of the vehicle alone is versus an appropriate therapeutic concentration of the enzyme. Bleeding, end of treatment versus baseline, there was actually less bleeding at the end of the study than there was at the beginning. And that's interesting, actually. I'd be interested in your views on this, audience, because there was a lot more granulation tissue there. And granulation tissue, at least in theory, could bleed a bit more. And I think when people talk about abnormal granulation tissue in the wound bed, of course, we haven't really got a way of saying what the granulation tissue is, but the granulation tissue that I'm thinking of in terms of abnormal is very friable and very easily bleeding. And we've got no evidence from our study that we caused any bleeding at any stage. Of course, as I explained to you, we didn't rub away, and if we had, we might have caused a bit of bleeding. For our next study, we will be using gentle physical debridement to help encourage both groups, that's placebo group or vehicle group rather, as well as the enzyme group, to try to encourage a little bit more debridement. Anecdotally, what was found was that there was definite solubilization of the slough in the patients. You could see it becoming yellow and watery and runny and falling off more easily. So one's hunch, again, a hunch until we do the randomized control study, is that we were able to affect the slough, but not necessarily remove it, because we weren't applying the standard quality of care that you would do in a clinical situation. We were doing this in a very carefully controlled and constrained clinical trial. So to summarize this bit, no increase of pain, no hypersensitivity, no drug-limiting toxicity, nothing in the blood, no effect on blood clotting factors, and no serious adverse events that we could associate, or the investigators could associate, with Terramase wound gel. We found evidence of dose-dependent debridement. Is this a commercially ready product? Sure as hell it isn't, because it isn't strong enough. It isn't debriding quickly enough and to the extent that we would like to see. So this isn't going to revolutionize as it is now. We felt there was evidence of dose-dependent increase in granulation tissue. And although I haven't shown you the data, there was evidence of wound healing. Now, there would be, because 4 weeks has gone by. So quite a few of the wounds had shrunk by about 50%. They started at an average of about 10, 12, 14 centimeters. They'd come down to around 6 to 8 centimeters. That's really all you can expect in a wound of this sort. Many of these wounds have been there for at least 3 months, and many of them have been there for over a year. So there was an improvement here, but of course, I can't say this is exclusively down to our intervention. I tell you what it is down to. It's down to state-of-the-art, really high-quality medical care. And we all know that when we do research, patients benefit in both groups. Even if the therapy that you're trying to show doesn't have an impact, they're all getting high-quality, well-constructed, well-delivered therapeutic interventions. And you can see the power of placebo. And that's a very well recorded phenomenon across all sorts of different studies. Now, in the manner of wound care studies, it's incumbent on me to show you a few pictures. Naturally enough, as you'll know from Western blots to wound care pictures, sometimes people select only the very finest of pictures. So I'm going to show you 3 successes. These are paired wounds. It's obviously the same patient some 4 weeks later. The wound size had decreased. The slough had gone from almost complete to very little in a 4-week period. And, anecdotally, the patient was feeling better. There's obviously better control of edema there, as you can see, in terms of the size of the ankle. This is another one. Lots of nice, healthy granulation tissue and plenty of healing going on there. You can see with the stuff outside, the bright red stuff. So plenty of slough on the left, very little slough, not none, but a lot less, and a wound that overall looks much healthier. It looks as though that wound is on the way. And maybe if we'd given it another 4 weeks, it would have been completely better. But of course, that wasn't part of our study. And our third one is again, a very, very sloughy wound and a significant reduction in size. These are all encouraging signs, but no more than that. And of course, I'm not going to show you all 43 wounds because we would be here. You'd be here at the time I am now, which is nearly 9 o'clock. So what are we going to do as a company? There's one thing I haven't explained to you. When we looked at these results, we were reassured on the one hand, but disappointed on the other hand with the efficacy. And we did some further work. Remember I told you the story of Santil and how the enzyme was trapped inside the Vaseline? Well, you see, what we found was that even in our standard hydrogel, it has an ionic backbone, and in that ionic backbone, quite a bit of enzyme resides. So what we found when we did some ex vivo and in vitro work was that enzyme isn't released from the low concentration gel in the way that we expected it to be. We know that because you can get fibrin plates and you can plate on different concentrations of our product and see the ring of inhibition or ring of fibrinolysis. And what we think has happened is you need to get to about 5 times, 9 times, or slightly higher before you really start to see the debridement in vitro. And that does chime with some of the clinical work that we showed you. Now, if you go back, I told you that 1 times enzyme strength was the same that the maggots produce. And I think the reason why our 1 times doesn't work in the same way that it does in nature, first, is because maggots do a lot more than just pop enzyme into a wound. And second, because I don't think that the 1 times that the wounds was exposed to was actually 1 time at all. It was barely more than the vehicle. So we have now reformulated. We now have 13 and 20 times enzyme. And we know that to be very effective. And we know that also to release promptly, significantly faster and for longer in vitro. We're also going to put in, for our phase 2b study, a wiping of the wound, not an aggressive scraping of the wound, but enough just to move off the worst of what the easily soluble and removable slough might be. Look, if we're too aggressive with the physical debridement, we might collapse the difference between the 2 intervention groups. As I go back, it's very hard to have 2 interventions at the same time, both of which affect the same thing you're measuring. So you really have to think carefully about how you do this. But having said that, I think we also need to replicate the clinical situation more. And now that we know that our enzyme doesn't cause pain, I think we are more comfortable about using higher concentrations, We have other data to show that actually up to 20 times there's no evidence of toxicity. And we can introduce other aspects that more accurately resemble clinical care. So we are currently trying to raise money for our phase 2B trial. And if that was successful, because that would be a vehicle controlled trial, then we would have something, I think, that had real potential, and I use the word potential carefully, to be a therapeutic product, provided that we could find a partner that was prepared to front up the very significant pharmaceutical related costs of making this drug, because we know roughly what we would spend had we got the money, and it's a lot of tens of millions of dollars to do this. And that's doing it on the cheap. If you were a big company, like I was saying at the beginning, like a Moderna or a Merck, you would probably have a budget 10 times what we have, and you'd answer all the scientific questions as you went along, do 3 times as much work, and probably take twice as long. But you would at least get a very, very good answer. So summarizing my talk, we've always felt there's a strong unmet clinical need for an available, accessible, affordable, and tolerable form of wound bed preparation. So the stage 1 of which, and the core of it, is adequate and successful debridement. No debridement, no healing. I don't believe, unfortunately, yet we have the data to say if you have debridement, you always get healing. I think it cannot be that straightforward, and I don't believe the data exists to prove that point at the moment. We have found that the FDA, the EMA, our UK regulator, insist that the only therapeutic outcome of interest is healing. And that's it. The FDA told us many times how thoughtful they were, how considerate they were, how they looked very carefully at our needs as well as the other needs. But at the end of the day, they've shifted not an inch. And it's fair because patients have to have an outcome that matters. A cleaner wound is a nicer wound to look at and possibly to smell, but it doesn't mean it's going to heal. And we have to show healing. And we get that. And that's what our trials are going to be, because not only are we going to do a vehicle controlled trial, but it will be for 12 weeks duration. And we would expect at least half of our wounds to heal in that time. So we believe that harnessing one component of the maggot, its main fibrinolytic enzyme, it has the potential. I think we have some proof of concept that can safely achieve debridement of a chronic venous leg ulcer wound. And by the way, I think it would be beautiful in diabetic foot ulcers, and I'd love to have the opportunity of studying them as well. I'm not so keen on pressure ulcers for all sorts of reasons, but I think if we could get chronic venous leg ulcers and diabetic foot ulcers sorted, we'd be in a very strong position commercially. So we're also going to work very hard on the bioburden. You'll be aware of the other big company, MediWound, and they've done a lot of work looking at the fact that their bromelain enzyme or bromelain-based debridement therapy, because it's a slew of different enzymes from the pineapple root, that certainly does reduce the bacterial load. You can use these molecular devices to show bacteria in the wound. It doesn't tell you which bacteria largely, but you can definitely reduce the bacterial load in wounds by using their enzyme. And I'll be morally certain, and we do have some animal data, again, going back to Steve Davis and other groups that we've used to suggest that when you add our therapy to animal wounds, which are acute, not chronic, you do get a reduction of the fluorescent signal indicating that we have less bioburden there. And I think that's of value as well. So we need as a company to show faster, more complete debridement. And we also ideally would like to be able to show a faster and more complete trajectory towards healing in our 12 to 16 week studies. And if we can raise the money to do that, we basically have everything laid up. We have our clinical research organization ready. We have some clinical sites ready. We have all the regulatory and other permissions and protocols and investigator brochures, you name it, all written up, ready to go. All I need is a ping to indicate that the money's hit the account, and then we can start work. And it'll be very exciting for us if we can do it. Eventually, if this is going to be commercializable, very different question from scientifically valid, that's a different story. And going back to my point, it's going to be expensive to do. And there has to be something that we can do better And our view is that if we could transfer the money that currently is being made by Smith and Nephew for Sandhill into our bank account, then that would pay back our investors very handsomely. So on that point, I might stop, and I'd be very happy to answer questions on what I've shown you and things more broadly, if that's of interest, within the limitations of what I can say. So thank you very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I look forward to any questions you may have. I'll stop sharing now, actually, so we can go back to a more social way of looking at each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Goldsmith. That was enlightening. That was inspiring. And that really answers a lot of questions that many of us have had. This is outside the traditional or pure biotherapy realm using live animals, but it is a natural extension. We've all known that the future was in harnessing the biochemistry of the various animals, whether it be maggots or whether it be cancer detecting dogs.
Yes.
The same type of principle is being pursued for all of them, other technologies that grow out of the biotherapy field. I have loads of questions, but I'm not going to ask a single one until the visitors, the participants, have the opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a question, unmute yourself and ask away, or we'll look in our chat and see if you have put anything in the chat box. I am not seeing anything in the chat box. I am not hearing anything on my speaker.
Right, Ronald, it's up to you. Okay.
All right, well, here goes. I've got my
Okay.
chance.
Okay.
It was very interesting at the end of your talk. Not that the end was the most interesting part. At the end of your talk, you said something interesting. That's a better way of phrasing it. That if somehow you could harness the money that is already being made in the commercial realm for enzymatic debriding agents to use for your studies. I just want to comment, as you well know, there are plenty of commercial companies that, or companies selling commercial products, competing with new technology that have been generous in purchasing those technologies only to put them up on a bookshelf.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so hopefully that will not happen to your research, because you've come a long way.
Yeah.
And I think the results are indeed promising. They may not be as exciting to many at this stage,
No.
but that's the way it goes for this type of research. That's what teaches us the next step.
Absolutely right. I totally agree. I mean, this is a very slow and painstaking development program because, of course, it's pharmaceutical, and you can't take two steps forward when one is the only safe approach to do. So I think, having got this one out of the way, the paradox is, I think we'll find out with the next study, with much higher enzyme concentrations and a longer duration, I think at the end of that study, and it'll be on about 90 to 120 patients, it's got an adaptive design, and it's got a sort of halfway house, let's see what's going on thing in case we have to increase the numbers. So we've got an interim analysis all baked into the trial design. If for about 100 patients exposure, we'll have a very clear answer. Can we debride faster? Can we heal at least as fast, if not faster? And those are important questions for all. I mean, if we still don't know for sure whether healing is faster in a debrided wound, then that's something that could come out of this, whatever else we find out. So I think it's all to play for, actually. I think we've got through to the next round, but one of these television quizzes, there are many rounds before you finally end up with a limousine, the sort of Cadillac or sedan or some sort. So there's a long way to go. But yeah, we're pleased that we have not found a dose-limiting toxicity, and we're pleased that we have found evidence that there is a biological effect here. But the very next thing to do, as I've explained, is to do it against best possible vehicle therapy, and then see. We would expect and want this therapy to debride these wounds in about 3 to 6 applications. That's, if you like, on the periodicity, the rhythmicity of 3 times a week. It's about a 2, maybe at the extreme 3-week intervention with our drug in the wound. And that would be faster than hydrogel. That's faster than autolytic debridement, at least twice as fast, maybe 3 times as fast. And that's as much as you need, because going back to my earlier comment, this is not a burn. This is not a medical emergency. This needs to be done in a way that doesn't disrupt the patient and doesn't disrupt the patient's healing. And if you put highly abrasive agents on that require systemic or local anesthesia and 24-hour hospital stays, that isn't really conducive to people in their 60s, 70s, 80s with multiple comorbidities. That's really making it into a hospital intervention as though it was a burn. And we don't think that's appropriate. So we're going in a very different direction.
It's not conducive to the third-party payers either.
No, exactly. Exactly right. Exactly right.
If anyone else has questions, jump in, but I'm going to take this opportunity and keep going. You discussed the possibility of including a more not too aggressive but appropriate removal stage to the investigational product. And I think that clearly better approaches your goal of having a study that reflects real life experience as well.
Yeah.
You may be doing this already, maybe not, but here are 2 non-aggressive methods: irrigation, and a gentler sponge without the fibers of a debriding sponge. Are you currently using what was the last study using to remove the gel?
The last study allowed for dropping saline onto the exposed wound. So you could call that minimal irrigation.
Very minimal dropping.
Very minimal. Designed not really to disrupt anything, and certainly not designed to cause any new symptoms that you could refer to the therapy. In practice, there is the opportunity, perhaps with some simple gauzes that are wetted, to do some very gentle removal. We will have to standardize that very, very carefully with extensive training, because one person's swift and effective removal is another person's agony. So it will depend very much on technique and consistency and a lot of site training. And this will be a challenge if we have to do this in a multiple site trial, as is likely, because we need a lot of patients. We can't rely on a single center. Maybe there's a single center that's the lead center that recruits a large number like we had in our first trial, And there we can be confident that we can train that the investigators very carefully. But however we do it, maybe we even have to video the procedure to check, and we can certainly have monitors present to physically to observe what's going on. And we'll have to do that because otherwise we may have a center effect where one group in, let's say, Texas, but to pick a state completely at random, rubs away quite vigorously at the wound. And in another part of the US, they're much more gentle and thoughtful about it, but don't actually debride at all. And we have to get some consistency.
Indeed, consistency and single centers are
Ideally,
ideal
yeah,
for
it is.
for evaluating your data. But on the
Yeah,
other hand, most regulatory agencies much prefer multi-center
they do.
studies, which introduce the real life
Yeah,
variability that
yeah, yeah.
that we're going to
Well,
see when a product becomes available.
yeah.
Here's another way, just
Hmm.
not giving this much thought except for 10 seconds. Here's another way that you may be able to semi-standardize your cleaning stage. And that might be with a foam product, which
Mm,
you
mm,
determine to
mm.
be gentle enough of a given size so it holds a fixed amount of saline,
Yeah,
and then instructing people to dip it, squeeze it, let it
yeah.
go, fills up, they hold it up, maybe shake it twice or whatever, but you're pretty much standardizing now the amount of fluid, the material, and only the force by which they wipe the wound needs to be
Mm.
or is not as greatly under your control.
That's a very interesting idea because we're certainly going to look for something we can standardize. I like that because, as you say, you've controlled the volume rather than having 500 mils on a big bag squeezed across the whole thing, or just a couple of drops. You actually have a fixed amount in a holder, what you were describing, and then squeeze that on. So the foam might well be a good approach to that. It's a helpful suggestion. I'll take that forward.
Um, oh, let's see. Connecting to audio.
Okay, that
Does anyone have a question?
Julie might be wanting to ask a question. No, she's not.
Okay.
She's muted herself.
Uh, if you've got a minute or two before
Yeah, carry on.
you
No
fall
problem.
asleep,
No, it's not that late.
none of
It's
us
only
are
nine
falling
o'clock.
asleep.
Okay, it's only 9 o'clock here. 9:20.
I had another question, and that concerns your graphical presentation of the results of the data.
Mm,
And you noted in passing that the zero concentration was
yeah,
not included in among those
yeah,
bars. But I
correct.
didn't understand why.
That's because what I'm showing you there, and I'm sorry I didn't explain that at the time, but I think it was actually on the slide, is all patients who started the trial with greater than 50% of devitalized tissue in their wounds. We felt that that represented the true target that we were looking at. The first cohort, the one that didn't have enzyme in it, as you quite rightly say, was different. That was the cohort that we first used just after the pandemic. And the wounds there were much bigger. The patients were considerably older. And for some reason, they had a bit less in the way of slough. All of those questions, which are very fair, will be dealt with a randomized control study because there we will be more precise about the wounds, 15 to 50, approximately, sorry, 2 to 50 square centimeters. We will make sure that they all have 50% or more at the beginning of the therapy, slough. We will have a run-in period because the FDA are very keen on run-in periods when you're looking at healing to make sure that these wounds are not healing so quickly that, hey, presto, in 2 to 3 weeks, they're all better. They don't want wounds that are going to heal themselves, because that's not a real, again, going back to real life, that isn't where the problem lies. A wound that's going to heal itself is a gift. We don't want them, actually, because if there's an imbalance of them between our vehicle group and our interventional group, we could get a very nasty surprise. So we are quite keen to have wounds that don't do a great deal in the 3 weeks of the run-in period, which is a compromise. That, of course, makes recruitment more difficult, because you will definitely lose some patients for a variety of reasons as you bring them back. But nevertheless, that's the only way to standardize the starting point. And then, of course, we're going to standardize the intervention across the trial, and the assessment is standardized as well. And that's the best I think we can reasonably be expected to do, to try to get results that are really only down to the presence of the enzyme.
Thank you for helping me to understand that group of patients was different enough from
Yes.
the rest to be appropriately left off
Yes, I
the
think
grafts.
it was. We were recommended to do that by some expert reviewers, and in fact, that all of this that I've shown you is published in the Journal of Wound Care in January 2024. So this is a published paper, and indeed the preclinical work, which I haven't really spent much time describing, was published the year before in the same journal, 2023. So we have two published papers, and we have presented these findings at several SAWCs and some European wound management. And of course, the meeting that Rob Kersner runs down in somewhere on the Keys in Florida every year in December.
I'd like to certainly mention my support for the run-in study design. You know, I believe that is why our data from the Maggot therapy controlled studies was so much stronger in terms of showing a difference between controls and treatment groups than many of the subsequent studies. Some were controlled, some were not controlled. But when you take all comers and you start a wound care intervention, many of them are going to heal quickly on their own. And
Absolutely.
when you eliminate those, and you don't really know which are going to be those because they weren't under your control and they didn't get the best of everything, whether in control group or not, right? As you described very well.
Yeah.
When you eliminate those by following them for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever period of time, then now you're left with a group of wounds that are truly problematic, truly not easily going to heal. And I think that's the best subset of wounds to study. You need fewer of them. The overall cost will be lower because you're not spending those extra weeks and weeks with them. Yeah, so I think that's a great plan.
Yeah, well, I mean, the FDA were clear that that's the sort of plan they expected to see. So when they say jump, as you know, we only can ask them how high.
Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. You've been most generous, and it's 20 minutes over an hour that we've gone. Not counting the fact that we started off 6 minutes late.
It's a rounding error now, Ron. Don't worry about it.
We wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Are and successes. Your discoveries help traditional whole maggot therapists as well, because they help us understand mechanisms. They help us develop better clinical trials of our own. They help us ask important questions. So we support your work because we know your work is supporting our research and intellectual pursuits.
Yeah,
So
well,
with that,
thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for those words of encouragement and for your very helpful suggestions. And it's been a pleasure to present. And it's been worth waiting for, because we've done the trial and all the analyses, so at least you can see the full story. And I hope we'll be in a position someday to return with something more exciting and definitive, or how we've moved to something different. And that's a little bit like I was saying earlier about the biotherapy with live maggots or even bagged maggots. I think they're going to get harder to find and harder to use unless you've got your own personal way of doing that, because some of the companies and providers have struggled to commercialize what's a great idea and is clearly of great value to a small number of patients, but is not really scalable and commercializable in the way that I think they originally thought it might be. And I hope we don't find the same. I hope we have something that's more applicable, more easy to use, but I've got to show you better efficacy and clear-cut evidence that it's a worthwhile intervention. But I don't think it'll ever be a burden to patients. That's the thing. I'm pretty confident that the worst it could be is no better than good quality clinical care. Anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Albert, for the technical assistance. Very nice to meet up. Hopefully, I've just come back from SAWC in Orlando. Hopefully, there'll be another meeting we can meet up and compare notes.
that would be great. And
Thank
you're
you.
welcome back here anytime.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.